You've got a limp, you've got back pain from the nerve impingement again. They got the claws in you, my friend.
All right, welcome to this episode of the Justice Team podcast. You just heard Greg Schaefer's rendition of Crash Into Me. And today we're talking about TBI cases. So we've done some TBI cases, TBI podcasts in the past, but this one hopefully is going to be a little different because we've got three attorneys, three superstars who specialize in TBIs. So hopefully they're going to give us some new perspectives on TBIs, some different things that they're doing, some new cutting edge technology, different ways of arguing TBI cases, proving TBI cases. So we'll do some introductions. So first we have Taylor Ernst. So Taylor, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us about your firm, where you're located, and some of the types of cases that you guys handle over there.
Yeah. Hey, thanks. I appreciate it. We are a firm that does 100% litigation. We have 6 lawyers and 6 paralegals. We don't have an intake team. If we take a case, we think it's a 7-figure case, or it's a favor, or we're pissed at the insurance company for something that they did. A vast majority of our cases are traumatic brain injury cases. That's probably 90% of the work I've done since I've been a lawyer. I've tried a bunch of TBI cases, and I've fought through just about every possible defense they can possibly come up with, whether they're saying it's a silent stroke that your guy has, or conversion disorder, or all the general defenses they bring to the table. And it's become my mission in the last year or two to educate other lawyers on TBI cases, because the victims really need the help, and they need enough money to take care of themselves forever, or they're going to have really serious problems in the future. And it's something that I want to give as much info as I can to other people. Happy to talk about depots or strategies or neurologist depots, or it's one of the reasons I really want to bring as much info as I can in my open book. So that's a little bit about me.
And Taylor, you if you go on your website, I see there's lots of resources for TBIs. There's a whole tab on your website talking about people that need help or resources with TBIs as well, right?
That's right. It's something that, in addition to providing some resources for lawyers, I got tired of having to tell my poor clients the same things over and over again. So I started, when I was going to have to explain something to the client, starting to record it in a way that we can eventually package up this stuff. And when we have new clients with traumatic brain injuries, we can provide additional resources to them that, I'm not a doctor, but we've represented enough brain injury clients that we have.
I thought you were going to say, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night.
That's the lifestyle, right?
So Ben, Casey, Ben and Casey are partners. I'll let those two decide which one gets to introduce themselves first.
Casey's more articulate, so let
Casey,
her know.
Tell us about your firm. I know you guys are your firm is relatively new. You two are not by any means, young lawyers, or I shouldn't say young, inexperienced lawyers, but the firm is newer. So tell us about your firm. Tell us what you and Ben are up to.
Yeah, so Ben and I are coming on our year anniversary from going out on our own. We had previously worked together at a larger firm for about 5 years just on our own team, and really over that time period developed. Ben had already kind of been in the game in terms of doing TBI cases and really developing an expertise in it, and his passion for it translated over to me, and I really took it on as well and have enjoyed working with TBI clients. And so when we went out on our own, that was something that we really wanted to focus on. And since we started, it had working on cases involving people who've had, I say patients, patients or clients who've had traumatic brain injuries is just something that we've continued to do and really enjoy. It is a unique area of personal injury law, and it's such a unique opportunity to help people who get passed over a lot. I can't tell you the number of times that we get calls from clients who have been passed over by other attorneys, and other attorneys just don't know how to deal with them. And it's something that we like doing, is kind of getting into it, because with those types of clients, it's like it more than others, it's so important to really get to know them. And that's our favorite part of doing what we do. So our firm is Ben and I and our paralegal. We have a law clerk too. We're out in San Diego, and we have just been enjoying this ride of a first year out on our own together.
And you and Ben both are part of the San Diego Brain Injury Foundation, correct?
Yeah, we have been for years now, and it's a really cool organization. They help brain injury survivors in a lot of different ways. They host community meetings. They also have their own. They have a home called Howard House that supports and hosts residential patients. They have 8 patients right now, and they just do a lot for the community in providing resources and information to both TBI survivors and their families, and do really cool outings and things like that too.
Casey and I both feel, we've been involved with San Diego Brain Injury Foundation on the board of directors. I think I was on for 6-7 years, and Casey's now the vice president of the organization. But both of us spend a lot of time working with survivors outside of the legal world too. And we find that not only helps us when doing these cases, but gives us, I think, an ability to be more patient and more understanding of what a lot of our clients go through. And so, at our firm, we call all of our clients survivors, and that's the way you need to look at it, I think, in doing these cases, which I think we're going to talk about some today.
So Ben, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Ben Coughlin. I'm partners with Casey, and I've been working primarily on TBI cases and catastrophic spinal cases for the last 10 years. And Casey and I both work on, consult on, and try TBI cases all over the state and the country. And that's what we do. That's our focus. And, we try to work and make this a better world for TBI survivors. It's both impacted Casey and I personally. And we get a great deal of satisfaction in helping clients that really want a voice to understand what they're going through. And I think Casey and I's unique perspective allows us to do that.
I will say, not to give you a free plug or anything, but Ben is somebody who's I know from personal experience, very passionate about MTBI. We say MTBI, minor traumatic brain injury cases. When my first major MTBI case that I worked up, I consulted with Ben a lot, and he was very willing and happy to pick up the phone and call me and explain to me what an axonal shearing injury is and what a subarachnoid hemorrhoid is, and hemorrhage, not hemorrhoid, but you know what that is too as well. So yeah. So I don't want to tell you to, call up Ben and blow up his phone and give his cell phone out or anything, but and I'm sure Casey and Taylor are the same way, but very happy to kind of share his knowledge and insight, because it's a unique area of law, and it's not something that's easy to learn. And so Ben's a great resource for me personally. So, it's good.
Well, that's very kind, Brandon. It's easy to want to help when you're working with great lawyers, and you and your team at Simon are, some of the most caring lawyers I know. And so we are always happy to help.
When we're talking about, I was going to talk about what we would classify as a minor traumatic brain injury, because I feel like those. So Ben, can you tell us the difference between what we would call a minor traumatic brain injury, we call it MTBI, versus the moderate to severe? Because those are usually the tricky ones that we have to spend a little bit more time educating ourselves on.
Sure. And I'm sure Taylor's going to want to jump in on this. Yesterday, we were chatting about this. We were talking to each other about some cases yesterday, and we were talking about this. So the classification system that has been used for way too long is a classification system of mild, moderate, and severe traumatic brain injuries. And what we're talking about when we're talking about that classification system is really the acute setting of the injury. And it really has, as time goes on, we're learning, has less and less to do with prognosis. It can, but there are, I think it's something that is often missed on our end with what we're doing. So I actually hate those terms, in particular the mild term, or minor, as you used it, and that's That is what defense will call it. And they want to use those terms mild or moderate as many times as they possibly can, just to instill in jurors' minds and whoever they're trying to prove it to, that this is not a big issue. Well, that couldn't be farther from the truth. While it is true that most concussions, which is a form of mild traumatic brain injury, while most concussions do resolve within weeks to months, there is a percentage that does not. And so any form of traumatic brain injury can have ongoing effects for people that continue past that kind of 2 to 3 month mark or well beyond, and sometimes for people forever. It's a term we used to call the miserable minority. It's another term I kind of hate, but based on different studies, that number, we believe, of people who have ongoing sequelae or symptoms from mild traumatic brain injury is somewhere in the 5 to 30% range, and which is much higher, than we used to think. And so when we're talking about this classification system, it's based on very little other than the acute setting. In other words, when someone first presents with concussive symptoms to a hospital or to a physician, first thing they'll check is what's called the Glasgow Coma Scale, which is looking at eye opening and motor reaction. And it's a system basically to tell if someone is conscious or not and how conscious they are, and really has nothing to do with long-term prognosis. But because this classification system kind of predates our modern understanding of brain injuries, that is one of the factors that goes into determining what is initially called a mild traumatic brain injury. And so a Glasgow coma between 13 and 15 would be classified as a mild traumatic brain injury. We then look at imaging, if there are structural imaging, and I'm sure we'll get in later. I know this is a favorite topic of Taylor and Casey, into some modern imaging techniques. But in terms of structural imaging, we'd look at MRIs, standard MRIs, and CT scans. And if there's no bleed or water or oxygen in the brain where it's not supposed to be, that rules out what we'd call moderate or severe traumatic brain injuries in the initial acute setting. And so by definition, a mild traumatic brain injury is a time where there's an alteration of consciousness. In other words, someone feels different, thinks different, is having headaches, any alteration of consciousness in that initial setting that includes a normal Glasgow Coma Scale and normal imaging. That's what a mild traumatic brain injury is. And so as defense lawyers, and we'll talk about this today, keep talking about how there was no loss of consciousness, which is also required for mild traumatic brain injury, that the Glasgow coma was normal and there's no abnormal imaging in the acute setting. What a smart plaintiff's lawyer should do is say thank you, because they are proving our mild traumatic brain injury. But unfortunately, a lot of us that do this, that don't have a full grasp on that, get a little frightened about that.
Yeah, so that's a good kind of segue into my next question. So Taylor, let me ask you, how do you spot a traumatic brain injury, especially a mild traumatic brain injury? Because when and this is probably the process a lot of people have who don't necessarily consider themselves subspecialists in TBI cases. We do TBI cases at my firm, but usually it's an overlay of something else. So we'll have a spinal cord injury plus a traumatic brain injury. A lot of our cases have multiple injuries on them. So what I usually do is I'll look at the police report, the EMT report, see if there's a loss of consciousness, see if there's anything funky about the Glasgow Coma Scale. I'll look at the CAT scans at the MRI or at the ER and see if there's positive, negative. And if there's not, I most of the time think it's probably a closed head injury that they're going to resolve in 6 months, and that's probably what the defense wants you to think. So how do you spot that issue? How do you see that this person is going to have a problem or is having ongoing problems? Is that a loaded question?
That's a great question. First off, I want to address the issue of the Glasgow Coma Scale. The defense absolutely loves it, and I want to just hand all the listeners a couple of weapons to just wreck it. The original concept of the Glasgow Coma Scale was how severe of a hospital do we need to get to them to immediately? Like, do we need to airlift them? Do we need to get them to a trauma 1 center? It was invented in 1974. That's before VHS videotapes. That's before digital cameras. That's 15 years before computers. And it was 4 years before MRIs were invented. And so when the defense does this whole, oh, what's the Glasgow Coma Scale? It's just, you need to put it in the context of how old it is, what it's used for, what wasn't available at the time. And then generally they do the Glasgow Coma Scale a couple of times after they get to the person. So the person can be unconscious for 5 or 10 minutes. Or if the ambulance or whatever takes 15, 30 minutes to get there, they're unconscious for a period of time. They get there, they regain some sense of self, and then the Glasgow Coma Scale will be 14 or 15, even though at the time of the incident, it's way different. And so you always want to cross on, well, if there's any other witnesses or discussion about unconsciousness, what would his Glasgow Coma Scale been shortly after the accident? What do you think about that then? And they will have to give up a much lower Glasgow Coma Scale, which puts them in a much more difficult time defending the case. So that's
by the way, right, Taylor, the inventor of the Glasgow Coma Scale, one of the two inventors, says that it should not be used as a prognostic tool.
Yeah, there's that too. But
yeah,
the defense lawyers don't know it, and they've gone to a bunch of seminars and they see it as the Glasgow Coma Scale and what it's for. And so early on in the case, I start educating the defense. And one of the issues, so circling back to how do you spot these TBI cases? It's symptom driven. Almost 100% of the time, I'm looking at how much does it affect their day-to-day life with what they're going through. And then I use the medical evidence to support the symptoms, because a number of the TBI cases I've even tried, unfortunately, had really poor medical documentation. Really, one of the ones I did last year, there was a negative. I mean, she didn't even get an MRI for 11 days. And even then it was negative. I mean, she went in complaining of left arm pain, and that was the initial hospital report. And it turned out she developed a stutter 4 weeks later. And that's what I ended up trying almost the entire brain injury case around, because that was what affected her life more than anything else. Is she can't communicate without having everybody judge her. And she's either got to say, hey, I got a traumatic brain injury, or people think she's slow or stupid or whatever other judgment they jump to. So going back to it, you can always look at the medical records, but more than anything else, we have a meeting with the client directly. And we go through we have checklists that we use of what are the symptoms bothering you. You don't need a whole bunch. You just want to know what ones are interrupting their day-to-day life. And then the follow-up to that is you need to have a meeting with their family. And you want to have a meeting with their husband or wife or daughter or one of their friends. And the reason for the meeting is twofold. First off, you want to have a meeting with the person, but one of the classic signs of a brain injury is they downplay it because they want to say they're fine, which if they're fine, don't make a brain injury case out of it's not. That's a whole topic that me and Ben can talk about till we're blue in the face. But you need to talk to the family members and say two things. If there is a legit brain injury there, you want to educate the family on what are the symptoms that they see, because they'll see different ones and have a whole different story than the person who is actually injured. And number two is you need to provide them some context of what the victim or survivor is going to go through and how it's going to change the family dynamic.
Is this something that you're doing? Right off the bat? You meet with a client right away before you even sign up the case and their family. How early on are you doing that?
I mean, within the phone call, if it meets our parameters, we set up a meeting right then. We meet with the client before we say yes or no, and we get the medical records after. It's inverse, but it's just a different approach. And
we do the same thing.
Exact same thing.
Yeah,
I think you have to in these cases.
Yeah, and it's symptom driven, very hands on, and it's something that I feel really strongly about with brain injury cases. I think they're a completely different category from all other personal injury cases, because there's a couple of things that are really bad about them. They cost a lot more to work up. They take enormous amounts of more time, and you have to put in more work to make the case where it needs to be for the survivor.
So Casey, let me, go ahead. Yep.
I was just going to say, I think it's important to stress that the medical records aren't really the end all be all of these cases. you're really not going to understand whether your client has a brain injury and what's going on from the medical records alone. Because oftentimes the client, I mean, think about other types of injuries. Like if your client has a broken arm, it's going to be pretty easy for them to go into the doctor and say, my arm hurts. But a lot of the symptoms that people have when they have TBIs are things that they're not really noticing. And so if you're basing your determination of whether this person has a TBI on what the medical records say, you're just not going to find it because they're not going to even know what symptoms to bring up to their doctor.
So I think we know a lot of, the common types of symptoms that we see: short-term memory loss, sensitivity to light and sound, tinnitus. What are some symptoms that maybe we're not as aware of that you have picked up on over the years?
I don't know that it's symptoms that we're not necessarily aware of, but it's more like the terminology that people tend to use when they don't know TBI terminology. So if your client or their family member says like, she's just really off lately, or she's just like not all there, or I'm feeling really foggy, those are some classic ways that lay people describe symptoms that are actually TBI symptoms. But
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, other ones are like things like they're dropping things, and usually that'll come like they'll give examples and they'll say like, oh, I forget my keys. And sometimes I'm like dropping my keys all the time. And so it's more picking up on how is their day-to-day life looking different, and what symptoms can you attribute those things to?
So like Taylor said, I mean, unlike any other case or most other cases, you're spending a lot of time with not only the client, but their family, their friends, documenting this stuff to getting I have, we do mostly spine cases at my firm. We could not talk to our client for months on end. And we have medical treatment. We know what the records are saying. This is if you're doing a TBI case, it's a little bit more involved, like Taylor said, right?
The other thing you've got to be very careful about is you're often dealing with denial too. And I'm sure this is something Taylor and Casey and I deal with. I mean, not just every week, probably just about every day. Your clients often are the worst reporters of their symptoms. Their family and friends are often much, much better, because I'd say more often than not, your client is in denial about their functional levels and the issues they have. And so you need to be very careful. Like Taylor was saying, when you do those initial interviews, it's very likely if you were talking to a brain injured person that you are not getting the full story and the full understanding. And so it's not just about talking to the family to determine, if there's an injury or not an injury. It's imperative because it's often going to be incumbent upon you as the lawyer to help that client get the care they need. That is another major difference all of us feel in brain injury cases than other cases. And that's in part because oftentimes your client's primary care doctor, even neurologists that aren't familiar with TBIs, are not going to properly treat your clients. And you need to get them or help them understand the proper rehabilitative care that they need. I know Taylor and I have talked about that, and I'm sure he could expand on that as well.
Yeah, that's one of the questions that I have is at our firm, and a lot of people that do TBIs have sort of the same formulaic check work that they do. I personally always get a neurologist on board right away that I trust, which are few and far between, and sort of let them tell me what to do or tell me how. And lately I've been seeing different types, like EMDR is a treatment that I've been seeing a lot lately that I've never seen before. So Casey, Taylor, I mean, why don't you fill us in on maybe some on how to get out sort of outside of that formulaic and start doing a little bit more tailored care for these people.
Yeah, so tailored care. You nailed it. So here's the thing that I end up doing more than anything else is I view the neurologist, neuropsych, and some of the other specialists that do it again and again as more of, you need them for just the defense, understanding you're serious about the case, but for talking about actual value and workup, I see them more as like special teams on a football team. Like they aren't going to end up making the case that is going to be the way that'll really get it done. It's symptom driven, and you need to find specialists to deal with the exact symptoms that they're going through. So there's a whole, as Ben and Casey know, every brain injury case is a little bit different. It's why they require so much more time. You really want to look at, let me give you some specific examples so you can kind of understand what I'm talking about here. If a client has a stutter that's interrupting their daily life, you want to get them to a speech and language pathologist that has a certification in brain injury specialty, so that they are doing treatment directly aimed at treating that symptom. The way I like my cases going into trial is whether they have a stutter, whether they have a vestibular issue, whether they have a hormonal issue, whatever the thing is that's really bothering them. And little aside here, hormones affect a good amount of people who've suffered TBI. It can be done with a blood test. And when there's a hormonal dysfunction or dysfunction of regulating the hormones, they sometimes will need like testosterone injections over the rest of their life. So it's something that you should look at. And it's a significant number of them because the way the brainstem sits within the brain, they're different weights. And so if there's a significant enough impact to the brain, a lot of the times it'll damage the ability for hormonal regulation.
There's actually a recent study out that says as high as 60% of people who suffer even mild traumatic brain injuries have some pituitary dysfunction afterwards, which is,
I've heard 75%. It's an older study, but it's high. And it's easy to rule in or out, and the defense isn't going to be able to deal with it. That's something else that I like to do with. So circling back, I like to treat what I can treat as well as I can treat it, and then go into trial saying, look at all this stuff we've attempted to do. This is what's permanent.
So
I was just gonna say, I think one thing that on that topic, or actually two things rather, one thing I see a lot is like, there's like the normal set of doctors that you go see. And a lot of people, like, I would say one of the most common questions we get is like, who's a good neurologist in San Diego? And the response is always, well, what are your client's symptoms? Because not all neurologists are the same. There are some neurologists who are phenomenal and can be kind of a quarterback on any case. That's fine, but that's just the quarterback. But you have to have a neurologist who has A, knowledge of traumatic brain injuries, and B, a specialty in the kind of symptoms that your client is having. So like if your client is somebody who has headaches, it doesn't necessarily mean that this X neurologist is going to work for you. You have to go to a headache neurologist. Or if you have a client who has vestibular issues or dizziness and lightheadedness, you need to send them to somebody who's experienced in those specific issues. And a lot of there's just not a ton of neurologists who can handle any particular type of client. And honestly, there's a lot of neurologists who just don't know.
What's a good resource for me to find that information? I mean, obviously reaching out to one of you three is probably what I'll do, but I mean, how do you find the right type of neurologist,
We sometimes interview experts before we hire them, and if we haven't worked with them before, we'll spend a bunch of time talking to them about hypothetical facts before we pull the trigger. Because like say somebody has a head injury and they have either seizures or micro seizures or some type of tremors, that's something that you do not want a neurologist who's going to get crossed eventually on it that just doesn't have the sophistication or doesn't have the background to deal with it. So you want to make sure that, and sometimes it's fine. And if it's headaches or certain types of dizziness that they've seen enough of, that's totally fine. But if it's something that's interrupting their day-to-day life, that's a major pillar of the case, you need to make sure you're setting it up with the expert that's going to be able to deal with those things. But by the time they go see that expert, you need to provide the expert with overwhelming force of documentation of why it is affecting their day-to-day life. You don't want to say, again, I call it like special teams for experts. You don't want to just bring them in and say, hey, you need to go see a neuropsych, you need to see a neurologist, you need to see this. You don't want to do that, because when the neurologist sees them, they're going to do what they do for all their clients. You want to go have them go see a neurologist with the supporting documentation, or with the medical records, or with declarations, or with depo excerpts of some of the lay witnesses that document more than, oh, I lose my keys now and then, because that sounds like anybody. You want it to be, I have a sticky note on my steering wheel telling me, remember to turn off the car and take your keys with you. So immediately, any audience member or juror or defense lawyer hears that and just goes, okay, that's not normal. Because then it breaks the entire case down into, okay, this is something that's serious that we have to deal with.
Yeah, go ahead, Case.
I was just going to say one thing that we do, especially for clients who we know are not good reporters, we have them bring their family member with them to the doctor's appointment so that they can, we have an adult client whose mom has been going with him to his doctor's appointments because she knows what he's going through and can talk to the doctor as well about it. And if it's impossible for them to go with them to the doctor's appointment, then you can have the doctor call the family members and do interviews of them, things like that. Just because that's really the best way that the doctor's going to get the information.
Brandon, I think to answer your question about what other resources you can use to find good doctors, one thing we do a lot, let's say it's not in San Diego, and Casey and I do cases all over, we will look to local brain injury foundations and organizations who often have relationships with good doctors. We'll call them directly and say, hey, who are the specialists in these areas? Most of those foundations, San Diego Brain Injury Foundation, Cal BIA, Brain Injury Association of America, actually has a list of all the local organizations as well. You could call those organizations, primarily those board members of those organizations and the volunteers are speech language pathologists, doctors, and physiatrists. And they know in their communities who are the specialists for different things. The other thing we do is we find, if we're doing a case out of jurisdiction, for example, we have a brain injury case in Las Vegas right now. We will call lawyers there that are specialists in TBIs. We don't just call any lawyer. We want to know people that have worked with survivors and that know doctors that are going to help, not just be great experts. And so I think that's very important. And I think it's kind of our obligation to the clients as well.
So I got one tip building off that, and just a practice tip that if you've got some brain injury case, I don't like calling them mild TBIs, by the way. You want to, if on cross, what you want to do, and that's been alluded to earlier, never ever call it mild, moderate, severe. That's defense lawyer discussion. Stay away from that as much as possible. They'll try and drag it into that. You want to drag it into, did they suffer a brain injury? Yes or no? Is it still affecting them? Yes or no? If it's still affecting them this many days after the initial incident, is it more likely true than not that this symptom is going to be with them for the rest of their life? And just go down the list and you're going to get a bunch of different, they're going to have to give it up. So that's number one. And number two is for defense medical exams. This is the weapon I've been using lately and I want to share it with people. For defense medical exams, I actually have the clients handwrite out a list of between 3 and 5 of the symptoms that are bothering them the most. And they bring that to the defense medical exam. And it forces the defense doctor in a horrible situation because either you're going to literally look at the list and ask them about each of them, and then it's going to be in the records and it's going to be on tape and he's going to get killed on cross, or he ignores it and then he's really going to get killed. And so, and the biggest problem has been alluded to already is generally, if they have memory issues, they have a difficult time relaying their symptoms, especially in an interview where they're like, tell me all your problems. And they go, I think I'm okay. You're going to be totally jammed up and have a problem with that answer. Where as if they're like, I have problems with my memory, therefore I brought a list. I have problems with my mobility. I have problems with my vestibular function. I have problems with my hormonal regulation. And I have problems with, word finding within a job. All of a sudden that case takes on an entirely different arc. The defense lawyer is going to get the report and go, what am I going to do with this?
So one thing, we spent a lot of time talking about identifying TBIs. It's very symptom driven, but I do know, and I do want to touch on this, is there are a lot of advances in terms of imaging and advanced imaging studies. So Ben, Casey, can you give us a little bit of insight on sort of the forefront new technology that we're using? I know advanced, DTIs, fMRIs, PET scans. I don't know how much those are used, PET scans, but some of the newer types of imaging that we use to try to identify objective findings on a TBI, because they're not, and even if you do use those, they're not always positive. You don't always get something back. But tell us some of the things that you like to see in your practice with your not your clients, what do you call them? There you go.
Casey, you want to start, or you
Yeah,
want me to?
I'll start it and you can pick up wherever you want. But for us, the advanced imaging, I mean, it is what we're seeing, at least in most of our cases, is at some point they're going to get a 3T MRI with advanced imaging kind of subsumed within it. And so you'll get DTI, you'll get SPECT, those types of things. We're not seeing PET scans very much. Or MEG scans, but it's for us, it's really dependent on what the doctor thinks is going to be the best solution or best diagnostic tool for our client. So we really, on that particular issue, we want to make sure we get the imaging done when it's needed. But in terms of the choice of imaging type, we really leave it up to the neurologist who's treating our client. But just like as a kind of what's most popular, what we're seeing most often, I would say the most often is DTI, at least as far as I can see. Sorry.
So let's kind of talk about what we're talking about when we're talking about advanced imaging, because I think that's important. Okay. And so I think in nowhere else in the TBI world have we seen more change and progress than in imaging, in particular over the last 10 years. Okay. I mean, when I started doing this, I remember we were one of the first to get PET scan into trial, admitted into trial. And we're so far past that now, it's interesting. I think the key to understanding is first understanding the difference between structural imaging and what we're calling advanced imaging. Structural imaging done on MRIs, X-rays, or CT scans is basically taking a snapshot of the whole brain. Okay, here's the issue we have. The brain is made up of somewhere between 80 and 100 billion with a B cells. Okay, and most brain injuries are happening on a very microscopic level, unless you're seeing a bleed. Okay. And so in particular, we do not have, even with all the advances, nor are we likely to have anytime soon, any ability to see a specific location in a brain and say, hey, those 10,000 cells are damaged. Okay. And that is because, again, if you're searching for a few cells out of 100 billion, it's far beyond even a needle in a haystack. And so what has happened over the last few decades is that imaging type studies that we've already have a foundation for. So for example, DTI is based on MRI. It is an MRI. It's a sequence of MRIs from which we are extrapolating water flow through the white matter. The white matter being the axons or the connectivity within the brain cells, okay, what's connecting all the brain cells together. And so they're watching the flow of water over time and determining whether that is normal based on comparing it to a set of normals. In other words, just like in neuropsych testing, they're taking this data and comparing it to what we're calling normal brains or a selection of normal brains. In fact, all advanced imaging is working, or at least for the most part, off of normal databases. PET scan is the same way. PET scan is simply injecting a synthetic glucose, a fake glucose into the system. So our brain functions on sugar, glucose in particular. The glucose is taken up into the brain, and then we're taking a sequence of PET images as the brain is being fired up to determine and then compare it against a normal database too. Similarly, in SPECT scanning, which is also a form of nuclear imaging, that you're having a synthetic marker injected and then you're monitoring that. MEG scan, which we typically see less, but is also based off of century-old EEG technology. So these are all these advanced imaging techniques are based on older imaging techniques that we are advancing forward and looking at in a functional perspective. Functional MRI is the same thing, okay? And so what Casey and I typically do, and we get the question, well, what type of imaging should we send our client to? The first step to take is make sure you're not doing anything without having your treating doctors who are assessing and treating your patients tell you what type of imaging they prefer. And they may not prefer any of those types of imaging techniques. But if you have an imaging technique with your doctor doesn't believe in, believe me, you are going to have major issues down the road when that expert is being deposed or you're having to make a decision whether to de-designate that expert, right? The second thing is oftentimes the types of neurologists, neurosurgeons, physiatrists who specialize in brain injury can be great quarterbacks too, by the way. It doesn't have to be a neurologist or a neurosurgeon. I think physiatrists who have specialties in this area can also be great. Is to understand that their health systems that they are in may dictate which type of imaging they like best. For example, here in San Diego, if you go to Scripps, they are going to use a specific type of advanced imaging, whereas you go to UCSD and see certain people in different departments, they may like a different type of advanced imaging. And so you need to be cognizant of that. Talk to the treating physicians, talk to your experts, and make sure they're on the same page about the type of imaging. Having said that, do we all as practitioners have our kind of imaging techniques that seem to be the most useful? Sure. But I don't think it really matters, because whatever your doctors and your experts want to use is what you should be using.
We could spend probably a whole day talking about imaging techniques and how practical and how good they are at trial, and how sometimes you may not even need one to see, a positive finding. So we are coming up short on time, but I did want to touch on something that I spoke to Taylor about briefly last week. Something that he's doing in his cases is using life care planners in brain injury cases, and getting the right types of experts involved. So we've got about 5 minutes left. So I want to hear from all of you, actually, what is your approach in terms of using life care planners in brain injury cases, and who they're working with? Are they working with your treating doctors, your neurologist, your neuropsych, your therapist? How do you handle getting those because that's a big number at trial. Future care for somebody that has an ongoing traumatic brain injury that's never going to recover. Got to make sure you get that right. So what's your process with looping in life care planners on TBI cases, Taylor?
I want to make one comment on what Ben was talking about before in terms of scans, and then I'll get to the life care planner question. Everyone wants the scans because they want to be able to show objectively the brain problem. Sometimes it doesn't have to be as high tech to get the same result. So you can have objective evidence of a brain injury in between the consciousness ability to respond to a stimulus. So there's some tests with the eyes, with ocular. There's a whole bunch of stuff on that. There's some tests with vestibular where they literally put them in a like a walking type gait thing. And what's so interesting about it is getting the data from those tests, you can actually see they don't have time to consciously compensate for their vestibular problem. And you can find evidence like that and point to it and go, that's objective evidence that there's a dysfunction within the brain related to a traumatic brain injury. And so there's ways to do the objective evidence without the scans, which is why everyone wants the scans, is they want to be able to put something on board and go, that's it right there. So, and the next thing is with your spine cases, you should be looking at them, because if there's enough force to cause certain types of spine injury, whether fracture or otherwise, you can sometimes use that to correlate it with a similar delta V to cause a brain injury, especially if there's axonal or rotational forces. It's significantly more likely to cause axonal shearing within the brain. But you can have a negative CT scan, a negative MRI, and rotational force on the vehicle or through the mechanism of injury and still have a pretty significant brain injury. So circling back and addressing the life care question, the gold standard is treaters. You have a treater, go on record with your life care planner saying, hey, this person has a severe deficiency in their balance, and it's going to be something that affects them for the rest of their life, is pretty important. Our life care planners usually look at stuff that are just called ADLs, activities of daily living. You want to start talking to your life care planners about things which are IADLs, Where independent activities of daily living, those include cooking, driving, managing finances. They kind of always think about them anyway, but you need to separate them and draw a line between the activities of daily living, like feeding yourself, dressing, bathing, and the ones that are a little more independent that a lot of brain injury survivors have trouble with. Getting a treating doctor to talk to your life care planner and say, hey, they're going to have functional problems for this forever, is pretty important.
How important is it, Casey, Ben, to have your life care planner, not just in TBI cases, in all cases, but probably specifically in TBI cases, to go out and meet your client in person at their home, not on Zoom, not over the phone? How important is that?
So important. And one thing that we've been doing ultimately the goal is to get to a point where they can really develop a super solid life care plan that's very inclusive. But we've been using life care planners a little bit differently and earlier on lately. So we've been hiring life care. We have one life care planner we use who she also does like social work. And so she has been helping our clients navigate the process, making sure, a lot of our clients forget that they have doctor's appointments. And so she will remind them of their doctor's appointments, get them to their doctor's appointments, sometimes go to the doctor's appointments with them. And she's really been with them every step of the way. And through that process, it means she's, spending time with our clients, seeing what their life looks like, talking to their family members, and really getting a very unique inside view of their life. And, ultimately she's going to have a much closer perspective to what our client's life actually looks like and be able to talk to a jury about that in a way that nobody else really will. And so I think it's so critical for a life care planner to be able to, they don't necessarily have to have that close of a view, and you don't have to do that on every case, but it's so important because the whole purpose of getting them on board is to really get them to paint a picture of what are their needs. And you can't do that unless you spend a ton of time with the client.
Building off what Casey just said, and then Ben, you can follow up, is one of the most interesting parts about the life care planner is you need them to present what they need, but you also need them to present what happens if they don't get what they need. Because there's a huge statistic about people with brain injuries out there, depending on the type of brain injury they have, that end up on the street homeless, or they end up in the care of some funding of the state. And getting those in front of the jury is incredibly valuable.
Yeah. I think part of the problem is unfortunately, the reason so many brain injury survivors do end up homeless is funding through the state is not as good as it is for other health issues and mental illnesses. And it's a gap in what we do in public because of the misunderstanding of brain injuries and the lack of understanding. I think, to circle back to what Casey's talking about, when we started this firm, one of the promises we made was, to really spend a lot of one-on-one time with clients, understanding and being with them and supporting them through the process of healing. And so what we did was, and what Casey's talking about, and what you can do in all of your cases for those listening, is that most nurse life care planners have companies that when they're not doing litigation, they're working as case managers, okay? And they also employ case managers at their firms. And so what we will do is we will find a life care planner who will be our life care planner for the case, get them involved very early, and then hire one of their case managers that works for that life care planner, which is at a much lower rate than you're paying the expert life care planner. But that case manager now goes with your clients to appointments, goes to your client's home, is a direct employee of that life care planner, and you now have built up this relationship with the client. And that life care planner's testimony at the end, when she's been with the client all the way since the beginning, and her case managers were working with them all since the beginning, is kind of unimpeachable. And you're paying a much lower hourly rate for a case manager employed by your life care planner. It kind of is shocking to me that more people don't do this in other types of catastrophic cases too, because it just can create such value. By the way, your clients love you for it because you are now taking the pressure off of them to remember their appointments. Often the case manager will drive them to their appointments, will sit in on the appointments and hear straight from the doctors. And that credibility that it creates for the case manager and life care planner really becomes unimpeachable.
It's also something that gets put in the life care plans all the time. Something that we like to do is you don't want to be asking for things in your life care plan that they aren't already doing. Like, why would we do that? You're asking it psychologically. If you ask for something that they don't have yet, why do they need it? They're fine on their own. Whereas if you give them what they already are going to be asking for, then you go to the jury and you say, please don't take this away from them. And it's a completely different ask.
Yeah, I think that's you could use that in pretty much any type of injury case and say life care planning. Make sure you only include what is really necessary. I mean, I think there's a lot of overreaching that goes on, and I think you need to police some of the reports that you see. But anyway, I'm getting the wrap up signal. This is honestly, I think we've only scratched the surface in this stuff, and I actually want to do a volume 2 somewhere down the line, because I feel like we haven't even touched trial or building damages, general damages. This has been really insightful for me too. So I definitely want to do a volume 2. Hopefully you guys come back, because you've got a lot of information that's really, really great. I think a lot of people would really love to hear.
I think this is the first TBI talk I've ever done where the host hasn't asked about neuropsych testing. And so, man, I certainly appreciate that. And I think all three of us probably are like, man, that's kind of nice.
Yeah, I think most people know how I feel about neuropsych testing. So, I don't even want to talk about it. It's I don't use it if I don't need to. So, but thanks guys for coming. I mean, I seriously want to do another volume because this was great. Thank you so much, Taylor. You guys want to do any plugs or anything, website or anything coming up that you guys want to? Do you guys do a pod? Ben, do you guys do a different? Do you guys still do your podcast, the brain injury stuff?
So we're not doing the podcast, but we post a lot. We're not doing the podcast anymore, but we post a lot of medical and updates on brain injury medicine on both our Instagram and Facebook pages, which is just Coughlin and Vanel. And then you can find our website at we're SanDiegoLawyers.com. So feel free to reach out if you need help on any of your.
How did you get that domain?
I was up at 2 a.m. one night searching for domains as Casey and I were starting, and my recollection is I started texting Casey at about 2:30 in the morning that I had found it, and the rest is history. Yeah, we like the domain. SanDiegoLawyers.com is it was a good one for us. Although we do keep a smaller caseload, so I don't know how necessary it is for us, but we do like it.
Taylor, anything you want to plug before we say goodbye?
Yeah, and if you've got questions, feel free to reach out to any of us on the panel. Because the smaller caseloads, we often will end up giving free advice or helping with things, or we'll just tell you, hey, you need someone that's a specialist on this, or hey, you need to do this, this, and this. This is what you need to do next. And we can significantly increase the value of your case with 5 minutes sometimes.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for taking time out of your day. Hope maybe the next one we could do in person. We'll see how things are in the world. But thanks so much, guys.
Yep.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Thanks, Brandon. Good to see you, Taylor.
Yeah, you too, Ben.
Yeah.
See you, Casey.